I will be reading Luke 12, verses 13 to 21, and Acts 4, verses 32 to 35. The parable of the rich fool. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops?" Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." Acts 4, verses 32 to 35. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need.
So in today's message, I first have to say thanks to people who sent all the pictures of the barns that were not yet pulled down to build larger ones. The message today looks at the parable that Jesus told about this man who talked about his money and his wealth, talked to himself. And the first thing I should say, just so you don't start squirming and head for the exits, is that this is primarily an affirmation of generosity of this congregation. It's not mainly a corrective. I think Albany Mennonite is a really generous congregation. I've been on the outreach committee now for 2 years, and so far we haven't been able to find a project big enough that we didn't get enthusiastic participation to get the job done. So those gifts that's above the budgeted giving that people also support generously. And then outside of that, I know from the stories that people are giving generously of their money, their homes, their cars, their food. This is a giving congregation. So my intent in looking at this parable is to look deeper, to understand our society, the cultural, socioeconomic conditions in which we live that discourage generosity and make it difficult. This parable, I think, has a useful, serious critique of how our own society and our own media talk about wealth and income. And then in contrast, we'll look at those early followers of Jesus and how they talked in a little different way about their own wealth. So I hope this helps us understand better the spiritual basis of our generosity and how we can pass this gift, this spirit of joyful giving on to our kids and grandkids. A little, disclaimer. I worked 20 years at the United States Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. I was one of a very few number of sociologists working amongst scores of economists. And so I've taken this parable and mixed in a little bit of sociology and a little bit of economics, and we'll see if it works. So the first question is, do you ever talk to yourself? So I talk to myself. It sometimes drives Judy crazy. I once told her that I only talk to myself when there's nobody more knowledgeable around to talk to. And you can imagine how well that went down. I only tried that line once, and it didn't work too well. And it wasn't true anyway, of course. But when we talk to ourselves, the thing about talking to ourselves is that it's unedited. When we talk to ourselves or mull something over in our mind, we're really we're being honest with ourselves about how we see things. We may not see them right, but we're being honest about how we see them. And I think that's why Jesus puts this parable in the form of this man talking to himself, because we are able to see into his mind, into how he understands things. So let's see if these are going to work. Wow. Okay, so this was already read. I'm not going to go through it again, but take a look at it and see if you can see what's wrong with it. Now, Jesus makes it pretty clear that there's a problem here. He calls the man a fool. He says, your soul's going to be required this night. But what is the problem exactly? The rich man didn't apparently steal this stuff, so wasn't it his property to store up and use? I mean, he didn't want it to rot, so building a bigger barn. Well, if this is his stuff, isn't this reasonable? Where's the problem? Well, one of the clues to the problem, if I can make this thing advance, there we go, is his uncritical use of first person, and especially first person possessive. So let's read it through it again and pay attention to that. What shall I do? For I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones, and I will store all my grain and all my goods there, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. 11 times the first person, while counting when he says, you to his soul. So it's all about me, isn't it? So he's fallen victim to the same illusion that can so easily mislead us. His society and ours teach us from our youth about money and wealth, how to earn it, how to save it, how to spend it, how to make things ours, how property rights are somehow almost sacred. This is so pervasive that most of the time we don't even think about it. That's how socialization works. It disguises the relationships of ourselves to production, consumption, and to our fellow humans, to the extent that we don't question those relationships. We accept them as the truth with a capital T, the only way things can be, or at least the best way they can be. So in a nutshell, the illusion here that our landowner falls into is considering that what is legally mine is ethically mine, that what has come under my administration belongs to me. Now, it's interesting that Jesus takes this apart. It's like, Toto in The Wizard of Oz when he pulls apart the curtain so you can see what's really going on back there. Jesus does not begin this parable, interestingly, with, there was a man who rented land and worked hard all year and so on. No, he begins, the land of a rich man produced much. So what was this rich man forgetting? Well, quite a lot, really. He was forgetting about the land itself, nurtured by generations before him, the community's gift to the present generation. Good land. His also forgetting about kind of the nature of his claim on that land. Now, I'm sure it was established by a set of laws, but they may or may not have really fairly represented the claims of others or of the community on the land. And he forgot about the seed that was created through generations of selective breeding that comes to him, able to produce like this, another gift of the community. He kind of forgot about the sun and the rain and sent by a generous God, or maybe just his good luck in hitting a really good year. And then he forgot about the laborers who actually did the work, tilled the soil, planted the seed, weeded, reaped, threshed. He may have paid them the going wage rate, but did that really represent a just claim on their part of the abundance that the land produced? So some of these are things that the rich man forgot or ignored when he appropriated all of this windfall to himself. It's also interesting the context in which Jesus told this. So there's two things going on here. So this man comes to him and he says, "Tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Well, Jesus refuses to do that. Then he says this interesting thing: "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." And then he told this parable. So this man asking to have the family inheritance divided to him was probably also asking for what was legally his. And yet, Jesus identified that as greed. In other words, not everything that we are legally entitled to is ethically ours if our ethic is informed by Jesus' teaching about the kingdom. This disconnect would probably be true to some extent even under the best and fairest and most just set of economic policies, but it's doubly or triply true in the United States. I know we're told that free enterprise capitalism, free markets, the best system available. There's a long tradition of this going back to Adam Smith. And they can prove it to you mathematically if you accept their assumptions, but you should look at their assumptions. But even if that's true, free enterprise capitalism can be implemented in many different ways by different sets of policies, and it is done so in different countries. And ours, unfortunately, is not the fairest. The US per capita income is among the highest among industrialized societies. And yet, our rates of poverty, food insecurity, income inequality, and poor health outcomes are not among the best, and in some cases, near the worst among the industrialized economies. Now, we could look at that and think about how to push the political and economic system in that way, but that's not what the message today is about. The message today is about what we do with that, given that we are living in that environment. How does that inform what we do with our wealth and with our money? But living in this context, it's more important even to remind ourselves that not all that is legally ours is ethically ours if our ethic is that of the kingdom. It can be liberating to talk in terms of the money that has come under my administration rather than my money. The funds that are in a savings account is under my administration rather than my money in my savings account. It'd be a really different parable if the landowner had talked in those terms. Now we're going to turn the page and look at a different example. This is, there we go. This was also read to you. I'm not going to read it all again, but I want to look at this first phrase. The whole group, excuse me. I should have had you turn off the microphone. I have this thing, especially when I take off my hat, that my voice goes. We'll try to keep it together. So there's a phrase here: no one claimed private ownership. In the Good News translation, this reads, none of them said that any of their belongings were their own. So they didn't say my wealth, but rather the wealth that has come under my administration for the good of the community. I don't think we are intended to read this as full-blown communalism. This is not something that is taught or pushed through the rest of the New Testament, but it certainly was a generous sharing community. How we talk about our wealth and our money matters. I want to take just a moment to talk about people on the other end of injustice. It should be obvious if the system is unfair that some people are going to lose out, as well as some people who are going to win out. And Jesus also has some words for them. It's interesting, first of all, looking at, say, the important sermons that Jesus preached, that he does not say to those who've been abused by the system, work harder, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, make a budget. The problem of economic injustice cannot be solved by those who are being beaten down by the system. What Jesus does offer is the encouragement and dignity of knowing that you are blessed by God. He said, blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst to be treated fairly, knowing that your poverty is not an indication of God's displeasure. It's not your fault. This may seem like a very little bit to offer to people who are being beaten down by the system and have come out on the short end of injustice. But we should do well to remember that Jesus' entire life and ministry was an indictment of the unholy alliance between temple worship and the Roman state. And this, perhaps more than anything else, brought down the wrath of those protecting the status quo and nailed him to a cross. These words of Jesus should be an encouragement to those who at some time in their life are on the short end of this unjust system. It's not your fault. It's not a sign of God's displeasure or of your being unfaithful. This should free you up to accept assistance from government programs, which are intended to kind of partly offset the injustices in the system or the problems in the system, and to accept help from the community when you need it. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst to be treated fairly, for they will be filled. Now, I had another little section in here that I'm going to drop out because something happened this last week that kind of brought this whole thing into perspective, and I want to try to share that with you. So we were in an area meeting in Mennonite Village. About a dozen of us or more, maybe seated around the circle. And the only Mennonites, or at least the only people from this congregation present, were the gardeners and us. And there was a material being presented on disaster preparedness, which is a very good thing. And there was some reporting back. I don't think this was the opinion of the woman telling us this, but she was reporting back from what had been talked about in the larger village meeting. And it was about having emergency food prepared and ready for, when the big one hits. Well, that's a good thing to do. But there was this thing that went by about, but then, if other people in the village don't, do the same, then they're going to need our stuff, and then there won't be enough for us. That was the phrase, there won't be enough for us. And this all we didn't have a discussion about it, just went by quick. But I'm pretty sure I could see Byron and Judy squirming. And Judy and I were squirming. Because, of course, if we have food and there's a disaster, of course we're going to share it. I could kind of visualize Judy Gardner going out knocking on doors to make sure there wasn't anybody that had a need. So anyway, there are disconnects between how we see those things that have come to us and how our society sees them. So I have one final thought on the way out, and this is about the offering plate, which we're going to pass soon. And I've heard some questions lately about why we still pass the offering plate when most people are giving online. And many have even set up automatic transfers. While those are convenient and good ways to give, I have nothing against them. I think it's great, makes giving of the things that have come under our administration even easier. But we still need to pass the offering plate. Just passing it is an acknowledgement of those gifts that other people have given, even though it's come through cyberspace. And as I hope this message has made clear, giving to the church or through the church is not like paying membership dues in an organization. Giving generously is so central to who we are as Jesus followers that some expression of that has to be in our services when we worship together. So we keep passing the plate. We give thanks, even if the plates are mostly empty. We know they've been filled. Look at the budget, at the bulletin. It'll tell you how much was in there. And yeah, giving is central. If there's one phrase to remember from the message, it is that not everything that is legally mine is ethically mine if my ethics are those of the kingdom. Amen.